Almost everyone in the Yu-Gi-Oh community has at least one archetype that they felt just missed on being something interesting and fun. Clearly, not all decks can be or should be Tier 1 meta, but there are definitely those decks that started with an interesting concept with significant potential that either never blossomed or just seemingly missed really tapping into that idea, largely due to incomplete ideas or incomplete execution. Remember, lack of competitiveness is not the only way a deck could land on this list. The only real ground rule I had for making this list was the archetype had to have some level of development. It had to have at least 10 specific direct support cards, either monsters, spell traps. Finally, why a top 8 instead of a top 10? I felt that adding a 9th and 10th deck would really have been reaching because these 8 are the only real decks that I think fell short. Failure to meet their concept. Alright, let's begin. Number 8. Cloudians. Why one should care. It's an interesting concept early in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where all archetype monsters could not be destroyed as a result of battle due to their seemingly ethereal nature, but they must also remain in attack mode. They were created in an environment when card-based removal was much less commonplace. What happened? A lack of monster choices produced a deck build environment that limited the amount of versatility to make multiple meaningful deck builds. Of the 11 monsters, only 5 to 6 of them are even viable, and the so-called boss monster, Eye of the Typhoon, is rather pathetic as just a pure beat stick without any real inventiveness in its effect. Position change? Really? The spell and trap support does not support the monsters in any effective or meaningful way. For example, it has a special summoning card, but Cloudians don't like to be special summoned. They like normal summoning. They have probably the worst draw card in the game, which is saying something because they have another draw card. It is also incredibly bad. They have 2 inefficient burn cards. There's just so much wasted opportunity. Overall, Cloudians are inherently slow even for when they were created and yet do not have the support to balance that lack of speed. Finally, the Cloudian Fog counter-based effects are inefficient because of the 3 that have them. 2 require removal from only themselves, not anywhere on the field. Overall, this concept could have been interesting if designed properly, allowing the player to attempt to play off of the battle destruction protection with card effect support, but obviously it did not turn out to be the case. Number 7. Kaiju. Why one should care. Incorporating the idea of 2 gigantic beasts going mano-a-mano and manipulating that interaction, leaving the opponent to strategize against such a reality. What happened? While Kaijus are not a bad pure archetype, I feel the designers missed on the idea of what Kaijus represented. Only a few cards in the archetype effectively embody the presence of Kaijus. One could make the argument that the counter system for Waterfront is designed rather nicely to simulate the fear imposed by a Kaiju through the destruction of cards on the field. The major problem is that it is too difficult to simply establish and maintain a Kaiju versus Kaiju board, which is the very spirit of the idea. In my opinion, there should have been a card like a normal spell that disallowed monster summoning for some odd number of turns unless it was a Kaiju. There should have been a card that emulated the fear by outside sources, i.e. through flipping cards face down or destroying set cards. When Interrupted Kaiju Slumber is the only one real card that emulates the spirit of the one-on-one characteristic of Kaijus, at least for me, it then feels like the designers missed the forest through the trees in hitting the concept. Sadly, if one more set of spell trap support for Kaijus were released, this disappointment could be short-lived, but it does not appear like that will be the case. Number 6. TGs. Why one should care. In a sense, TGs should have been the model for all future synchro decks. What happened? On paper, TG looks like it checks off a lot of the boxes. It has its own archetype-specific creature swap, A-Forces, and Pot of Avarice, and all the monsters attempt to create some form of destruction-based advantage. However, the biggest problem with TGs is that for a deck that was supposed to be highly based around synchro summoning, the rewards provided for that summoning were few and far between, especially because the deck has trouble snowballing. Basically, for TGs, once a single monster is synchro summoned, the play typically stops, and that impact of the single summoned monster is not overwhelming. Whereas compare the single monster to the play potential of a synchro deck like Synchrons or Speedroids, or the impact of the synchro like Yang Zings or even Resonators, and TGs are just left in the dust. TGs still have a chance to reclaim their birthright, so to speak, but they need new high-quality support, especially when it comes to new monsters that would allow them to actually take advantage of some of their strength, like Cyber Magicians, Sync from the Hand, or their floating capacity to set up more synchro action over future turns. Number 5. Vampires. Why one should care. One of the first attempts to create numerous on-field floaters, as well as an interesting simulation of the blood-sucking aspect through the loss of cards from the deck. What happened? The floating aspect was actually effectively executed for the time, but simply over time has just been power creep. The deck discarding aspect of the deck, though, was generally flawed from the beginning by allowing the opponent to select the card that went to the graveyard after the player selected the type of card. This concept should have placed much more power in the hands of the player playing the vampire deck. For example, instead of simply picking one type and then allowing the opponent to select the specific discard, the player should have selected 3 cards from the opponent's deck, and then the opponent would have sent one of those cards from the graveyard with varying levels of control depending on the level of vampire. For example, some could have banished cards, some could have taken from the hand, some could have eliminated the ability to play certain named cards, similar to the spell card prohibition. Overall, the deck discard was too one-note and far too weak. Number 4. Gemini. Why one should care. Gemini monsters represented a separate and unique attempt to usher a powerful monster onto the field in lieu of tributing. What happened? While the initial intention of Gemini monsters may have been to produce an alternative path to summoning powerful monsters, Konami did not seem to understand that the costs associated with this path required actual payoff. The simple fact is that the effects associated with Gemini monsters pale in comparison to the powerful effects possessed by numerous tribute monsters, defeating the purpose of committing summoning resources to the Gemini monsters in the first place. Apart from the effect divergence, the level 4 or lower standard windows for attack power also reduce Gemini monster viability. Basically, when tributing monster A for monster B, you will typically receive a monster with a better effect and significantly more attack power. With respects to Gemini monsters, when second summoning the monster, its attack point typically remains the same, producing limited enhancement to what it can kill. To compensate for this weakness, the effects of Gemini monsters should have been very impressive, but overall they were actually substandard compared to a number of tribute monsters. In a sense, all level 4 or lower Gemini monsters should have had an innate attack and defense point increase effect when Geminis were summoned for the second time. Overall, it is understandable that designers may have wanted to trade off certain Gemini elements for the convenience of not having to use 2 cards, the tributed card and the tribute card, thus increasing timing efficiency for this alternative powerful monster summoning mechanic. However, the effects given to Gemini monsters were not even remotely good enough to justify this type of exchange. Number 3. Violons. Why one should care. In a sense, Violons were an archetype that attempted to reboot the doomed concept of union monsters, at least at the time, which is now getting another form of revival thanks to Kaiba and the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie. In essence, there is an interest in the idea of a Transformer-similar concept of a card being a monster and an equipped card at one time or the other. What happened? Putting it quite simply, similar to Union monsters, Violon just had too many restrictions on their flexibility and versatility of the overall concept and of the cards themselves. Overall, the biggest problem was the lack of being able to equip from the hand, which also significantly hurt the first generation of Union monsters. Another problem was the card design was not flexible enough to address the inherent inefficiency of running numerous equipped spell cards. Also, the perplexing decision to make some of them fairy types and others machine types certainly did not help deck efficiency or consistency, especially when it came to more generic support options. Number 2. Maj Esper. Why one should care. When the Maj Esper archetype was first announced, It was like dropping a pseudo-nuclear bomb on the community. An entire archetype that could not be targeted or destroyed by card effects. They were pendulums, the most broken summoning mechanic in the game, and they search other Magispector monster spells and traps when either normal or special summoned, producing constant free advantage. Some proclaimed Yu-Gi-Oh! Ruined. Yu-Gi-Oh! Over. Magispectors, Tier 0. So, what happened? The biggest problem with Magispectors is that people underestimated how difficult it was to keep your scales, which was the real power behind the Magispector engine. Among the other major pendulum decks, Clefort has good field control, searching with Scout, and recover with climate change, lessening the reliance on keeping the scales. Pepe pendulums basically floated and produced significant draw potential, and magicians are protected by Iris and can easily reboot their scale with various spell cards. Magispectors have none of these advantages, leaving their scales very vulnerable. Players also underestimated the ability of Magispectors to wrest control of the field from the opponent once he or she had actually established a significant field due to the generally low attack power of the Magispector's monsters. Also, the emergence of an anti-targeting meta sucked the wind out of a number of their spells and trap. Who cares if something's searchable if you can't use it effectively? Furthermore, Tempest, among all the other archetype-specific summoning negation, was basically slapped in the face by the release of Solemn Strike and Grand Horn of Heaven. The anti-destruction effect was somewhat handicapped by the release of new Mirror Force variants that could remove monsters from the field without destroying them. And finally, the need to tribute to set off their spells and traps was almost collateral damage to the rise of monarchs due to the frequent side-decking of Mask of Restrict. While Magispectors certainly have not been a complete bust in a sense that they sit around gathering dust, based on the level of hype that accompanied them into the game, they certainly have been a grand disappointment. Number 1. Morphages. Why one should care. Similar to Magispectors, this archetype entered Yu-Gi-Oh! With a lot of hype and general concern from other players. The idea of an entire archetype that could lock down various play strategies for the opponent, in essence locking them out of the duel completely, was rather concerning. There really was no general play mechanic that a particular Morphage monster could not say, "No, you don't get to do that" to. What happened? Despite the deck having the capacity to lock down the opponent's ability to do things, in spirit only, for the deck is incredibly inefficient and inconsistent. It is difficult to maintain your scales beyond the activation turn without infection or persona on the field. The deck in general lacks attack power, in that over half of the Morphage monsters worth running have 0 attack, and thus are entirely dependent on infection to accomplish anything while monsters on the field. The deck is incredibly susceptible to monster wipes via cards like Regeki or Mirror Force variant. This is pertinent because despite the monsters being pendulum, again, over half of the monsters worth running cannot be pendulum summoned from the extra deck due to being below the standard developed scale, between 3 and 5. Overall, the entire idea of Morphages was ill-conceived in the notion of an archetype that can continuously shut down an opponent's play option with almost 0 investment, as well as the final execution of the design was just bad. In a sense, I'm pleased this archetype fell flat on its face, at least for the time being, because I'm someone who does not like being able not to play a particular aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! Over a consistent basis. Well, that closes out my most disappointing archetypes. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.